Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second session of Beyond Bohm, Imagination, Creativity, and Dialogue. I'm James P. Barbieri, Associate Program Director here at the Power Center, and I'll be your host for this series. As a host, I'm here to help you throughout the call, so any issues, let me know in the chat. Before we begin, let me just remind everyone of the guidelines for this call. First, if you can please mute your microphone to ensure good quality audio, but also we do invite you all to turn on your cameras. The chat will be closed during the presentation and discussion, but it will be opened up when we have the Q&A and discussion with everyone. And then we'll have a third section where the discussion will continue, where the chat will be closed. But when it's open, feel free to use it and share your thoughts with the group. Finally, this session is recorded for archival purposes and for you all. As mentioned, the recording should be available in a couple of days for you. So today, I am honored to introduce our second panel for the series, comprised of Tim Ingold, Melissa Nelson, Lee Nichol, and Hester Reeve. Tim Ingold is Professor Emeritus of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. He has carried out fieldwork among Sami and Finnish people in Lapland and has written on environment, technology, and social organization in the circumpolar north, on animals and human society, and on human ecology and evolutionary theory. His more recent work explores environmental perception and skilled practice. Ingold's current interests lie on the interface between anthropology, archaeology, art, and architecture. His recent books include The Perception of the Environment, Lines, Being Alive, Making, The Life of Lines, Correspondences, and The Imagining for Real. Then we also have Melissa Nelson, who's an ecologist and indigenous scholar activist, formerly a professor of American Indian Studies at San Francisco State University. She now teaches at Arizona State University in the School of Sustainability, Global Futures Laboratory. From 1993 to 2021, she served as a founding executive director of the CEO of the Cultural Conservancy. Melissa is also the bundle holder of the Native American Academy. She's a co-editor of Traditional Ecological Knowledge, Learning from Indigenous Practices for Environmental Sustainability, published by Cambridge University Press. She's also the editor of Original Instructions, Indigenous Teachings of the Sustainable Future. Melissa is an Anishinaabe, Métis, Norwegian, and a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of the Chippewa Indians. We also introduced Lee Nichol, a freelance writer and editor and chair of this series. His latest works are Entering Bohm's Holoflux, and as editor, the forthcoming Holoflux Codex, Form, Movement, Vision, inspired by David Bohm, both by Para Publishing. He was a longtime friend and collaborator of David Bohm and is editor of Bohm's On Dialogue, The Essential David Bohm, and On Creativity. Lee sits on the advisory committee of the Power Center, the advisory council of the Indigenous Educational Institute, and is member of the founding circle of the Native American Academy. He lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with his wife, Eva Casey. Finally, we have Hester Reeve, who is a reader in fine art at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. Her practice encompasses live art, drawing, sculpture, poetry, philosophy, and dialogue, as set out by David Bohm. Hester's work has been shown internationally, including a former Randolph Street Gallery, Chicago, Live Biennale in Vancouver, Bone Performance Festival, Switzerland, Tate Britain, Yorkshire Sculpture Park, Halle G, Vienna, and most recently, Nairok Sculpture Park in South Africa. Hester is a contributor of the forthcoming book Holoflux Codex, Form, Movement, Vision, inspired by David Bohm. Today, this panel will talk together on Imagining for Real, the title of Timothy's book, which is coming out. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Lee. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much, James. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today for this second session. If you'll allow me, I'd like to share a brief story with you to indicate a little bit about the inspiration for this session with Tim and Melissa and Hester. It was, I think, 1992. It was the last year of David Bohm's life. And a number of us had been together with him in outside of Victoria in British Columbia in Canada at a retreat center. And during one of the last evenings, it wasn't the very last evening, maybe the next to last evening, I went out to dinner with David and his wife, Sarah. And one thing led to another in that conversation. And David got on this rhythm and this sequencing about imagination. And this is something that he'd written about maybe 16 years earlier in a Festschrift for Owen Barfield. He had written extensively about imagination. But in all the years I had known him, which was maybe 12 years, this had really never come up, this question of imagination. And so I was quite taken aback when he really went extensively into his thinking about imagination. And the essence of what he conveyed that really stuck with me and is still very much with me was his sense of imagination being a capacity in which we bring forth a world, which is very different from how we often think of imagination. We're in this world and then we imagine things from within that world. But David was talking at great length and great detail about how it can be very different from that, about how we can be participants through a deeper kind of imagination in bringing a world into being to begin with. And that was 30 years ago. And I've been working and investigating and experimenting with that ever since, sometimes with success and sometimes not. So I was just flabbergasted when just a matter of a few months ago, Hester sent me a short email. She said, "You have to see this." Okay, what is it? And it was a link to Tim's book, Imagining for Real. And I got the book right away. And I have to say, it's been more years than I can count since I read a book that just floored me, that left me speechless. And part of that was because here was a seemingly endless array of ways to investigate a kind of imagining that had, at the very least, a sympathy with what David Bohm was talking about. And maybe today we'll look a bit at where some of these areas intersect. But it's just been a delight to enter into what Tim has brought forth with this new book. And with that, I want to thank Tim, and I want to thank Melissa, and I want to thank Hester for making this happen today and joining in this session. So enough of a prelude. I think a good way for us to begin, Tim, in your book, in multiple variants, there is a phrase, knowing from the inside. And I thought it would be helpful to all of us today if you would share with us a bit about your project of the same name, Knowing from the Inside, and how that unfolded and what was involved in that, and how it led to the book, Imagining for Real.
Okay, that's a very long and big question. Actually, Knowing from the Inside was the title of a research project for which I got funding from the European Research Council, quite a lot of funding, from 2013 to 2018. And when you apply for a project to the European Research Council, it always has to have an acronym. The European research people are really, really hot on acronyms. So it became KFI. And so we were all known as KFI people. And it became coined as this acronym, KFI. And only occasionally did we say, well, what does this actually stand for? But as you say, it stands for knowing from the inside. And that comes from the idea that of wanting to challenge the dominant model of academic knowledge production, according to which somehow the analyst stands outside the phenomena that he or she is investigating, collects information or data from this world that stands outside, brings it back, analyzes it, and turns it into knowledge. And that seemed to me to be both intellectually and also ethically a suspect way of proceeding. Ethically, because it denies the inevitable involvement of ourselves in the world that we're investigating, and not just the involvement, but the obligations we have towards it. That when we develop ways of knowing, we are also giving back something to the world for which we owe our own existence. So that the work we do is part of that reciprocal obligation of what we owe for our existence in the world. And so I wanted to start off from this premise that we know from the inside of our participation in a world. And of course, we're not really creating, there's one phrase I really hate it's much used in academia, academic knowledge production. I've never seen myself as a knowledge producer. I am trying to know and understand things, but that's not so much production. I'm not producing stuff as engaging in a conversation. And the important thing about a conversation, of course, is that it should carry on. I mean, when we were developing this project, there was some discussion about the title. One or two colleagues felt that it's potentially misleading, this phrase knowing from the inside, because somebody who didn't know where we were coming from might think that we are born again Cartesians. And what we mean by knowing from the inside is that all our knowledge is sort of concocted inside by this interior mental processing device. And of course, that's the opposite of what we had in mind. But anyway, the phrase stuck, and no, it's just 3 words, but it worked quite well as a way of repositioning our own the kind of research we were doing. We wanted to redefine what research actually meant. That to research is to search and search again, a second search. There's like every time you go for a walk through the same landscape, you see something different, but it's the same walk. So it's like you walk and you rewalk and you rewalk, and every time you find every walk is a repeat of what you did before, but an original intervention in its turn. And that's the model of research that we wanted to develop, and to see what its implications might be across the fields of the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Although, of course, we were centered in my own discipline of anthropology.
Oh, thank you, Tim. And my impression is that your current book, your most recent book, Imagining for Real, is a direct outgrowth of that project.
It is, yeah, it is really. So, well, in a way, I mean, it's largely an outgrowth of that project. But then the project was an outgrowth of work I've been doing before then. So I don't really see the project as some kind of separate stage. It was just a kind of natural evolution. It's more for the purposes of research administration. You have to have projects, but the reality is a sort of continuous current.
Right. So you warn us early in the book, if we're looking for a definition of imagination, we might be looking fairly hard. And part of the virtue of that, to me, is that we do keep opening as we go through your work, what is this imagination? It's not what we thought it was. It's something different from that, but what is it? So if you don't mind, Tim, I'd like to put up on the screen a brief quote that maybe gives us just a little handle. And I would ask you, if you would, to elaborate on this a bit.
Okay.
Let's see here. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So
Okay.
I'm having, let's see.
I can see it.
Okay, here we go. By imagining for real, then, I don't mean the suspension of disbelief, an excursion into the land of what if, or the artifice of taking an interior mental model or world picture for a putative exterior world that may or may not exist in fact. I refer rather to a way of entering from the inside into the generative currents of the world itself by balancing one's very being on the cusp of its emergence.
Okay. You want me to explain that?
If you could, yes.
Okay. Well, the first thing I suppose is to say that the two words imagining and real are both as important as each other. I mean, part of the problem I had with this book and also in the title is that I want to get beyond the polarization of imagination vis-a-vis reality. I mean, that's in my mind is where the problem lies. The problem lies in the way in which we are continually seeking, we meaning sort of in the Western intellectual tradition, we are continually seeking to define something that we call imagination somehow by way of its opposition to something else that we call reality. And rather than trying to say, well, this is a book about imagination rather than reality, or a book about how we imagine what we take to be real or vice versa, this is really about how we can find a language to take us beyond that particular opposition. And in a way, that's what I was trying to get at in that passage that you read out, that all the things which I'm saying this is not are ways of setting up that opposition. And I want to say I want to get beyond it, which is why in many ways I really don't like the word imagination. It's not a good word. It has image inside it. It's a word we've inherited, so we have to make do with the language that the past has given us to us. So somehow we can't just ignore the word imagination. So I have to engage with it, but I also have to admit that it's not on its own the word that I really want. What I want is imagining for real. I want these two together in such a way that we can move beyond them. And then I suppose the other key aspect of that is that the philosophy I'm advocating there, which is also, of course, with Bohm, it's a philosophy of becoming, so that I think we can only get beyond the opposition of imagination and reality by shifting from a philosophy of being to a philosophy of becoming. And that also is what I want to get at there, bringing forth a world, exactly as you mentioned in your introduction. So I'm with Bohm on that.
Thank you, Tim. I would invite our friends Hester and Melissa to join in and take us anywhere we might want to go from what Tim has just shared with us.
Wonderful. Well, Hester, I'm inspired here. Thank you so much, Tim. Really appreciate your book and your work very much. So provocative. And like Lee, I have been kind of blown away by the insights that you bring forth that have so many parallels, not only with David Bohm, but with indigenous ways of knowing and being, which I know you've been deeply immersed in with some of your work with the Sami people up in Sapmi or Lapland. So I love this idea of knowing from within. It's so important and so unique in a way. And yet for many indigenous peoples, we know from without. And that the Haudenosaunee, for example, the Six Nations Iroquois, write about imagination coming from the land. The source of imagination is not in the human head. The source of imagination is outside of the human skin, outside of our porous bodies, and that it's a correspondence, one of your words, that really enables humans to imagine for real with the living earth and with the creation that has already been created but is constantly renewing itself. And so I'm just curious about your reflections on that and if that resonates with you. And so much of your work is breaking down these artificial boundaries of inside and outside, imagining and real. And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about, knowing from within and knowing from without. And that really touches on your great work from the perception of the environment.
Okay, do you want me to respond, Lee, originally, or do you want Hester to ask something first? Which would you prefer? Oh, you're muted.
You're on mute, Lee.
No, please, Tim, feel free
Okay.
to respond to Melissa.
Okay, no, I understand what you're getting at there, and the idea of the land as being the source of all creativity in that respect. But then human beings, along with every other living thing, is part of that earth. So you're still knowing from the inside, because in a way you're inside this whole thing. Land, maybe in the Western tradition would call it cosmos, or something like that. That you're inside this earth. And I think the key point I'd like to emphasize relating to that is that when we use words like knowing or even imagining, there is a tendency to suppose that is something that's you can sort of affix to a particular person, a particular individual. This person, I am knowing, or I am imagining something, or I am knowing something. But I think the implication of this approach is that knowing and imagining are ecological, in the sense that if you want to say, where are they? They're not in the head of an individual. They're system properties of the land. So imagination is not something, or imagining is not something I do. It's something that almost happens to me because I'm part of this thing. I think, yeah, that's my best answer to that one.
Yes, agreed. Like I said, it resonates so much with so many indigenous ways of knowing that we talk about an ecology of mind or a sacred ecology of mind. We can only create or imagine with all the beings that give us life in that moment in real time. Thank you.
Hester, would you have something that would carry us further?
Sure, of course. It won't be a direct question because I don't work like that, and I'm so stimulated by your book that I'm going to have to sort of speckle back at you, if you know what I mean. And you can say whatever feels relevant for you to say in response, if you get my gist. My sort of overarching thing is art, but I'm also kind of suggesting we boot it out the window, possibly, in terms of how we standardly understand, at least in Western perspectives, the work of art. So I'm sort of coming from the fact that as an artist, I make artworks, and it's a fantastic thing to be involved in. But I've never felt like that's the most important part of it. It is for me in my little local corner of lifing and living. And when one of the things that struck me as an artist in your book, as an artist who's sort of been perplexed and somehow sometimes confused in my life as an artist by this issue of what I might call the art of life, the art of living, the art of encountering life, but without having to step outside it and make an artwork about it, which of course I inevitably do. And it seemed to me that there was something about the way you're talking about imagining for real. And I was thinking about Bohm and this amazing term he came up with called art movement, which was, you know, me making artworks would be a specific local part of that movement. But it also encompasses the universe actually in its own playful capacity for meaning without anthropologizing, you know what I mean, that. So to get closer to sort of a question, although maybe that's already enough, I really feel it's and there's a lot at stake, and you often use the word the knife edge of where we're at. And it's like you are getting at some sort of art of life process, as if imagining for real, it felt to me like something very specific that human beings have in our physical and sensual and brain makeup that moves within all of this, and that you don't have to be an artist. This is not about going to art school or any of that stuff, as brilliant as I might think that is. So it's like you're, you know, I'm playing, but I love the way it was like a call to a new form of art movement, but not of artists and the avant-garde, but of who we are as creatures. And I use that word because I don't mean egos and self-deceiving. So I think, yes, and that in that creative, creaturely way, it's like you talk about exposure, that there's something about that movement with imagining for real that allows us to really be exposed within our lives. So I don't know if there's anything in there that you would talk about in terms of art. And if there's not, then the way you discussed the Lanyon painting and this very specifics of a sort of call from him is also wonderful to share with people. That's your get out clause if I've been confusing.
No, you haven't been confusing at all. I think I link all of this to our understanding of education. Education is the way in which a society produces its future. And so it's a question of what kind of future we want. And to my mind, you know, rather than talking about an education in art, one should rather think of art as a way of educating. I mean, I was once talking with some colleagues about this, and we suggested that maybe, for example, a school located in a neighborhood somewhere, say a primary school, kids going every day, parents in there and out, stuff going on, that school could be regarded as a collective and collaborative community-centered work of art. It's something that is continually being created as a wonderful thing, right at the heart of the community. And what it's about then is recreating future generations of that community by allowing older and younger people to collaborate in producing the future. So that's where I would like to situate art, certainly not as art products, as these creative goods that artists are supposed to produce for audiences or the market or whatever, but rather as a kind of what I call the art of inquiry, a kind of way of carrying on in a manner that is curious and investigative. And the work of art is the carrying on of this process. And most artists that I speak to are pretty comfortable with that view of things, although it's contrary to the sort of institutional gallery market view of what art is. So in that sense, I suppose you could say that life is a work of art. There comes a point too, I mean, one of the let's go back a bit. One of the reasons why I'd always been hesitant in my earlier work about addressing the question of imagination was that it always brought back this question about whether there's something special about human beings. I'd gone to such lengths to try and break that down, to sort of say, no, there isn't anything particularly special about human beings. And as long as I was just talking about perception, that was all right. But as soon as you bring imagination back in, you go, okay, is that something that humans do? What about the other animals? Are they imagining or not? And you get into all these awkward kind of questions. And it's rather the same with art. And actually, there comes a point where I decided that that in a certain sense, anthropocentrism is not a bad thing. And if we say anthropocentrism means putting us, anthropos, at the heart of a world for which we are responsible, and then recognizing that there are certain ways that we do things which are human ways and perfectly okay. We use words, we write, we tell stories, we do art, and it doesn't really matter in the end whether these are things that other creatures do or not. The fact is that we know we do them, and they're part of our way of relating to, engaging with, in a responsible way, in a responsive way, the world around us. And I can't see anything wrong with that. And so I get rather annoyed, well, not annoyed, but I find myself a bit critical of routine dismissals of anthropocentrism or demonizations of anthropocentrism as this bad thing, because the trouble with them is the only alternative they offer is an ecocentrism that doesn't have any constructive role in it for humans to play at all. And when we're trying to look for we're looking desperately for a constructive role. Here we are on this planet. We want to do something constructive in it. So we need to find what we can do. And we don't find what we can do by demonizing it all the time, by demonizing every possible human intervention, by demonizing words or even art. So anyway, that's where I go with that.
I have a reflection on that. Thank you so much, Hester, for that wonderful insight into art making. And Tim, there's a wonderful proposal by some dear colleagues of mine, Enrique Simon and Dennis Martinez, that we've gone from the anthropocentric worldview, and then the preservationist movement, the environmentalist movement wanted to go to an ecocentric worldview, but left out humans. So we went from this completely solipsistic, human-centered kind of idea. And then we went to this, nature without humans idea, this biocentric or ecocentric worldview. And they propose, those are both, erroneous, problematic polarities, and that we need a kin-centric worldview, because in kin are our relationships, humans included. Just as you said earlier, we are inside this living earth. We cannot be separated. We are a creature. We are an animal, despite all these other faculties, language and imagination and tool making that we think make us so unique and special, which we're finding out other animals do all of these. So kin-centrism is a worldview being proposed that really goes beyond those two polarities and really engages in our kin making, or I think you've called a matrix of relationships in some of your writing. And it's in that matrix of relationship and treating each other with respect and honor and reciprocity that we can actually move beyond some of these divisions we see in the world today. How would you respond to that proposal?
On the whole, I'm in favor of it, and I've been involved in some initiatives along these lines. The only caveat I would raise is that if we're going to, because kinship is one of those things that anthropologists think that they know, that's what they do, and so you have to be a bit careful. And the one caveat is that we are then talking about kinship in a way that has nothing to do with genealogical connection.
DNA.
Because that messes it all up. And sometimes you get people going on about how we are kin with the rest of the world because look at the Darwinian tree, look at our close relatives, the chimpanzees or whatever. And that rhetoric is deeply misleading, I think. Whenever anybody says, how close we are. Now, when Jane Goodall shook hands with a chimpanzee, you know, the media went crazy, and basically this was the handshake that spanned 6 million years. And I thought, well, how many million years do you span every time you stroke your cat? And the thing being simply that what we're talking about here is relationship and not relatedness, in a strictly genealogical sense. And relationships are things that are created through in life, through performance, through what you do with other beings, which throws a spanner in the works of a lot of modern biological thought, which is still rooted in ideas of descent and inheritance.
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah, that kind of reminded me of one of your other questions, if I may, Lee.
Yes, please.
Yeah, one of your other points about evolution and really critiquing Darwinian evolution in some ways. And I love how I don't know if I completely understood it, but I loved your evolution in the minor key. That is such an incredible concept, and you're really differentiating evolution in the major key, which I understood is the mainstream Darwinian evolution, genetics, as we were just discussing, but then you're proposing something much more subtle and nuanced, and that's evolution in the minor key. And I love using the musical metaphor and, you know, the sense of hearing. So if you can share a bit about that, would be lovely.
That chapter, evolution in the minor key, originated in a small symposium, which was it was run by University of Notre Dame, or Notre Dame, I think I'm supposed to pronounce it in American, but it was held in London, and it was I think the title was something like the evolution of wisdom, or evolution and wisdom. Anyway, these were the two key terms, evolution and wisdom. And there were evolutionary biologists, anthropologists, a few archaeologists, and a smattering of theologians. It was a fairly small meeting. And what I really wanted to do in my own contribution to the debate was to get away from the idea that wisdom is some kind of cognitive capacity that had evolved through variation under natural selection. There was still this mainstream view about the evolution of cognition, that through natural selection over the brain had evolved with all these various different cognitive mechanisms, and nobody was quite sure what wisdom meant or how to distinguish between wisdom and knowledge. But there was a feeling that wisdom is something that humans had, and it must have evolved somehow. And that was most of the papers in that particular symposium were following that kind of line. And I wanted to counteract it by arguing that this word wisdom stood for it was not something that had evolved, but stood for the other side of the evolutionary process itself, the side which going back to Alfred North Whitehead back in the beginning of the 20th century, had argued quite explicitly that there is this other side to evolution, and that the Darwinian mechanism leaves it out, and he wanted to bring it back. But he was completely sidelined by the subsequent history of science in the 20th century. And so I wanted to bring that back as well. The distinction between major and minor actually has its source in the work of this huge philosophical work of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, 1000 plateaux, 1,000 plateaus, an enormous rambling study, which is many people are going on about. Most of it I find completely incomprehensible, but every time I open it, I discover something of interest. And the distinction between, they have this distinction between major and minor science, and I found that actually quite inspiring, and that's where it comes from.
Wonderful, thank you.
Can I just come in there while we're on wisdom? There was, in the book you talk about the very thing you've just spoken about, and then you talk about wisdom as being existential, and as in not in the human, not coming from the human head. And you only make teeny weeny references to philosophy direct. But, you know, it's quite pointed when you do philosophy with the people in it. And I just wondered if that, when we look at, not look at, that's the wrong word, but when we open ourselves up to wisdom in that sense, how does, I mean, I think that's a really exciting call to philosophy or non-philosophy. And that might not be a question that interests you. If it does, what would you say?
Well, I have to be sort of careful about, or it's like driving a car, and you have to look carefully on either side of you. There are dangers on two sides, and one side are what I would call the philosophy for the philosophers. There's a kind of philosophy that professional philosophers in the game, you know, in the academic game, the kind of philosophy they do, which is very largely talking to themselves and almost entirely founded on what they call the canon. You know, the canon is this long string of mostly dead white men, from Aristotle to Nietzsche and all sorts of characters in between. And somehow, if you're doing philosophy for philosophers, whatever you want to say has to be somehow grounded in a critique of what these various distinguished precursors had to say, whilst ignoring everybody else. Now, for me, the beauty of anthropology, and the reason why I'm still an anthropologist, is because I think anthropology does anthropology asks philosophical questions, but it answers them not by reference to the canon, but by talking to people anywhere, everywhere, and finding, you know, they might not agree with these people, they might be awful people you talk to, but at least they reckon that the more people you can bring into the conversation, the more you're likely to learn. What is distinctive about anthropology for me is that it is the one discipline that is prepared to take what other people have to say and what they know seriously as something worth engaging with. It might be nonsense, but it might be worth engaging with them because it's always possible that you might learn something really rather important. And it seems to me that in the present day and age, we cannot afford to ignore all the wisdom of all the people of all the earth and say, oh, no, it's all in Aristotle, to Nietzsche, this handful of dead white men. So that's the one thing. I had to steer clear of philosophy for philosophers in order to do the kind of philosophy I want to do. But on the other hand, I had to steer clear of New Age romanticism. And there's an awful lot of that about. And it is much of it careless, it has its heart in the right place. So you don't, you know, mostly people say, oh yes, but they want a nice life. They want to feel comfortable in their position, and I find a certain kind of self-righteousness and preaching to the converted, which is also unhelpful in a way because it doesn't challenge, it kind of evades the really tricky questions that have to be thought through. So I've been trying to steer a middle path between professional philosophy, because I don't want to go there, and New Age romanticism, because I don't want to go there either. But it's quite tricky to find the middle route.
So one point that keeps kind of percolating up here is this question of wisdom. And as I recall in your book, Tim, excuse me, you make a connection between wisdom and what you call the soul, and contrast that with the self, and knowledge, or the self and intelligence. Whereas over on this side, we have wisdom and the soul. So that's one area we could begin to take a look at, but I would like to torque it in a particular way. That I think when we're in this realm of wisdom and the other qualities that you associate with the soul, that we're finding ourselves right in the middle of movement, plain and simple. That movement is central to these qualities that you associate with the soul. And there are so many aspects of your book that hinge on this question of movement. And needless to say, this is one of the areas where there's enormous overlap with your work and that of David Bohm. That Bohm has explicitly stated that the basis of his metaphysics is movement. And so for many people, this can be confounding, right? It's a feeling of movement. Okay, well, yeah, so what? We know what movement is. Why is that the basis of a metaphysics? And part of the problem is that when you take that view, it's usually coming from a purely conceptual, an idea of what movement is, rather than also a somatic, experiential sense of movement itself. And of course, I know from my friend Leroy Littlebear, from a Blackfoot perspective, that flux and movement is at the very core of a Blackfoot way of living and a Blackfoot worldview. So from at least one Indigenous perspective, and I suspect more, and from Bohm, and as I understand it, from Tim Ingold, there is this centrality of movement that shows up in so many different ways in your book. And so I'm hoping you might comment on that. And in the second half of our session here today, I have a few more points about that I would like to bring up. But just in the more general sense, within your body of work, could you address this question of movement and perhaps even its relation to wisdom?
Okay, yeah, I can. First of all, I can say that yes, movement has been central to my thinking all the way through. I mean, I should perhaps say that this book, Imagining for Real, it's a collection of essays that were written over the past decade. That's during the 2010s. But the book is the third volume in what I conceive of as a trilogy. So there was another collection of essays that I did, of essays written during the noughties, and then the first collection, called The Perception of the Environment, were essays compiled during the 90s. So the book I compiled during the noughties, between sort of 2000 and 2010, is called Being Alive, and that the subtitle is Essays on Movement, Knowledge and Description. So movement was quite central to that. And that's the first point. And the second point is that in some of the essays of that book, I did go to some lengths to try and explain what I meant by movement and to distinguish that from the physical sense of motion. So an engineer discussing motion would regard it as the physical displacement of an entity from one point to another. And I wanted to make clear that that's not what I meant by movement. I meant something rather more like a process of growth. And one of the examples that I've used to explain the contrast is how we understand the activity of human walking. Right? We walk along on 2 feet. And amongst some people, some indigenous people, and the group I'm particularly thinking of is people called the Batek, who are forest hunters and gatherers in the tropical forests of Malaysia. the Bartek say that people walk, of course, through the forest, but so do trees. Trees walk, and you know, at first you think, well, that's a bit mad. Trees don't really walk around, but the point is simply that they do, because they're referring to the tree's roots. And as the tree grows older, the roots extend through the soil. And so the tip of a particular root pushes its way through the soil as it grows. And that, for the Bartek, is a form of movement akin to walking, because when a person walks, in their understanding, it's not the displacement of this coherent, self-contained body from point A across to point B. It is actually, like the growing root of the tree, a process in which a living being kind of pushes forward into the world and leaves a trail behind them. So that's why, you know, one of the books I wrote was about lines, because I wanted to think of people not as points or blobs moving around from one point to another, but actually as lines of movement. And those lines of movement are movements that where they're growing from the tip and pushing forward into a world and leaving a trail. So that's what I understand by movement. But then that movement can also coil around itself, and the much of my inspiration for this, I mean, some does come from David Bohm, but before that, it came from reading Henri Bergson. When I mean, back in about 1982, I was writing a book about evolutionary theory, and I happened to pick up Bergson's Creative Evolution, and that was the book that blew my mind. I was completely bowled over by it. And at one point in that book, Bergson explains that a living organism, although it gives the impression of being a kind of stable, bounded entity contained within its skin, is really just the envelope of a movement. And that what we see as the form is this envelope. And he compared it to an eddy in the winds or in the river, so that the water in the river is going along, something deflects it a bit for some reason. It deflects and then turns around on itself. And before you know it, it's all winding up to a point until its energy begins to dissipate, and then it gradually flows back into the river again. So that's how eddies form and dissolve. And Bergson was basically saying that when we look at an organism, what we're really looking at is a particular eddy in the flow of life. And that idea really stayed with me. And when I'm talking about the soul in that particular chapter of Imagining for Real, I'm thinking of the soul as this kind of vortex in which a movement winds up in itself for a while before going back into the world again. That's not the soul as it's understood in Christian theology. They have the Christian idea of the soul is somewhat different, but it is the idea translated as soul in anthropological literature that comes from studies of indigenous people, particularly around the people that I'm familiar with, living around the circumpolar north, or northern people in northern Canada, northern Siberia, and so on, who talk a lot about souls and what happens to souls. And for them, my understanding is the soul is this kind of a vortex. It is, you can't step into the same soul twice, you know, because it's actually a flow, and you can't discipline it. You can lose it. You have to find it back again. But so that's where it links to movement, links to the soul as a kind of vortex. And with wisdom, I wanted to explain wisdom as a way of opening up to the world rather than closing yourself off from it. That's where it links to this, I think the word came up earlier, this idea of exposure, that it's actually by exposing yourself to things that you pay attention to them. And wisdom lies in paying attention to things. and not pretending you don't need to pay any attention because you already know. And we all know about this idea of getting lots of knowledge so that you can shore up your defenses against the world outside. You know, that knowledge is in mainstream education. Knowledge is understood as what you need. It's a process of arming yourself. You arm yourself with knowledge. It's like an armor, which is both defensive and also maybe offers a mode of attack. So it's this attack defensive posture. Wisdom means you simply take your armor off. It's a process of disarmament and hoping that by that means you might actually understand what's going on. So that's where that comes in.
No, thank you, Tim. There are so many marvelous questions bound up in what you just shared with us. And I'll loop back onto a little bit of it to do with what you described about movement and how you're trying to distinguish one kind of movement from a more typical notion of displacement. Early on, when David Bohm was formulating his implicate order, he calls it he refers to the implicate order as an imagination, as contrasted to a model, which I think is a very remarkable statement, that the implicate order is an imagination, not a model. When he was formulating that, part of it, sort of the underlying movement in the whole scheme, is what he and Basil Hiley, his collaborator, called holo movement, the movement of the whole. But there was a period of time when David and Basil debated back and forth if they should use the term holo flux rather than holo movement. And that debate arose for the very reason that you've pointed out, that there was a concern that holo movement would convey this sense of displacement from one point to another, and that holo flux has many much more subtle implications than holo movement. It has to do with transformation. It has more to do with that movement that you described and that Melissa just gestured. For better or worse, holo movement is what stuck, but holo flux is still, I think, personally, a richer and more viable term for the kind of movement that Bohm was alluding to. So with that, I would like to take a pause here and invite people from our audience to participate, to share any comments or questions for Tim. James, could you get us going with that?
Yes, absolutely. So firstly, I'd like to say that the chat is open, so you can contribute with the rest of the group or ask your questions directly there and I can read them out for you. Otherwise, you can use the raise your hand function and I'll call out your name. I can see Lloyd already has his hand up, so we'll go straight to him.
Well, good morning. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. And just this morning, I came before this talking with a friend, and I shared with her that something that has come up for me in a number of these discussions has been shaped by my learning years ago that in Mayan, and I've since read there are other languages, there is no verb to be. The only way you can express your existence, like in Mayan, I can't say I'm Lloyd, you're Lee. The only way you can express your existence is in relationship to people, relationship to clan, relationship to place, relationship to the energies. And what I'm aware of when we're talking about things is that whenever we use the verb to be, like yesterday it came up in the discussion, what is consciousness? And the moment, as particularly in our culture, the moment we say that consciousness is this, we have contracted the possibility of what we see resides within the realm of consciousness. And so I offered my friend this challenge this morning. Let's play around and talking about things like this without using the verb to be. So I just throw that out and request your comments on that.
Thanks. I think what is consciousness is a badly formulated question, really. It doesn't, because it obviously assumes that there is a thing somewhere to be found called consciousness. With a little sort of badge saying, "Here you find, here it is. I'm consciousness. Here I am," and all these neuroscientists trying to find where it is or locate it somewhere in the brain, and I think it suffers from the same tendency, which I think probably comes from also having this word to be at the center of verbal constructions, is that in most sort of standard, what is called standard average European languages, the sentence has a subject verb object construction. So there's the boy kicked the ball. Okay, so the boy, the subject, kicked the verb, ball, object. As you get someone doing something to something else which is done to, and that's kind of standard structure. I've been very excited by what's called the middle voice of the verb, which is very widely found probably in Mayan and certainly in other Amerindian languages, and also in ancient Greek way back, where everything is contained within the verb, so that you are what you are doing just at this moment. So instead of the boy kicked the ball, you just have a word kicking, which would include within it, it's a boy doing it and a ball being done to, but they're all, both the boy and the ball are sort of boying and balling inside this kicking. So everything becomes a verb. You almost have a language with no nouns at all, and for us speakers of English, French, German, and other such languages, it's extremely difficult to express this because we don't have the middle voice of the verb. But the middle voice of the verb is achieving something which is achieved in you, and I found that we don't have to choose between the active and the passive sense of the verb, because we're actually in the midst of it all. And I find that very helpful. And I think if one started from there, then the issue about consciousness would be posed somewhat differently. Don't ask me on the spur of a moment to try and pose it differently. I'm not sure that I could do it, but I certainly, whenever I see all these learned articles from neuroscientists and the rest telling us what they think consciousness is, I find it very, very frustrating, really, because of the ontological assumptions that are built into that way of formulating the question.
Well, and of course, it's not just consciousness. I mean, anytime we say anything is, you're talking about organisms, and organism just being an envelope, or I forget what the term you used, for this movement, for this flux. And that's what happens anytime in our language we say something is, we have contracted it and made it a discrete thing without all that possibility of movement.
No, that's true. I agree.
Thank you, Lloyd. James, do we have another questioner?
Yes, there's a few interesting questions in the chat, actually. There's one that's come up that asks, imagination is only focused on future events or fantasies. Isn't it just a tool of survival we share with all creatures? The only difference being our ability to use language to store and use knowledge.
No, I don't think that's right. I mean that we can I mean, if we want to use imagination in that sense of sort of thinking up dream pictures of a possible world that are not the world that we see around us just at this moment, and many people would use imagination in that sense. It can be a future world, but it can be a past world as well. So, I mean, archaeologists spend much of their time imagining what a past world might have been like. So do historians. All sorts of people imagine what science fiction writers imagine what a future world would be like. But what I find much more interesting is the possibility of getting even beyond that binary, that polarization of past and future. So just to give you an example, I'm very much like the word longing. When we say we long for things, it's partly because of the along nature of it. I like the linear sense of being along, but also because when you say you're longing for something, it's and you say, oh, do you mean something that you had in the past but don't have anymore, or something you'd like to have in the future? Because I don't really know. It's somehow when you're longing for something, whether it's that timeline doesn't really seem to be terribly important. It almost seems as though one's in a different register of time altogether, a time more like the weather, or the temps in French means both weather and time, but the time of the weather is not one that's marching along from past to future. It's just doing its thing. And if I could tell one quick story, is that we once had visiting us a great colleague, Ricardo Nemirovsky. He's a mathematician and an educator, and we were doing a workshop with him. And it involved laying out a rope on a large flat field. It was a football field, so large and flat. We laid out this very long rope, several hundred meters, in exactly the form of a parabola. We sort of measured it all out and set out parabola on the ground. Then we held a piece of perspex to our eyes, and we were asked to use a felt pen to draw the line of the rope as it appeared to us on the perspex. Then we looked to see what we got on the perspex, and what we got was an ellipse. Now you can understand that very easily in terms of the mathematics of conic sections, but the really interesting thing was that these lines of the parabola that seem to be separating from one another off into the far distance on our perspex had actually closed up. And what it seemed to be a beautiful example to me of how, when you go right to the horizon or beyond the horizon, then past and future, which appear to be heading off in different directions, actually come together and close up on that model of the ellipse. So I'm trying to think of a kind of imagining in which we keep finding that we are out of that linear past to future sense of time, and find that we're always older than we were and younger than we've been. Somehow where time goes round and round like that rather than marching on.
Thank you. There's actually another one from the chat as well, which is regarding anthropocentrism and whether there's something unique about human creations. This person be interested to know what the panelists think about the difference between art and technology in relation to imagination. And they know that's a big question.
Mhm.
Well, remember that the word technology is a neologism of, I think, the 18th century, maybe a little bit earlier. That was the first time when people linked up the two Greek words, techne and logos, to form technology. And for a couple of centuries, technology meant the study of techne. Just like biology is the study of living organisms, or anthropology is the study of humans, biology, the study of living organisms, technology was the study of technique. And it still means that in some countries, in France, for example, in French, that's still what technology means. But in Anglophone countries in particular, since about the beginning of the 20th century, technology came to mean a sort of thing out there, a set of operational principles that is lodged in machines and artifacts and things like that. It became an object of study rather than a way of study. So if we go back, then we find this distinction between art and technology is only 200 or 300 years old. Before that, we had these two words, ars and techne. Both of them had Greek roots. Ars has its roots in a whole set of words with R in them, like art, like harmony, like articulate, all of which come from the verb meaning to join things. And techne, which goes back to weaving, and originally to tasha, which is a Sanskrit for the axe relating to carpentry. So art and techne, they were pretty much the same thing and referred to all kinds of skilled activity, of the kind of thing that human artisans and makers have always engaged in. So I think we should, on the whole, go back to that.
I'd like to just add on top of that, if I may, that I really agree, you know, and that when I hear that question in this context, and it is a big question, part of me wants to reverse engineer that and say, actually, there is no difference in that both are forms of world opening or world closure. And the difference is actually who we are or what our thinking is in relationship to them. And I'm thinking of what Bohm writes about ours and it linking to, he has a whole passage in On Creativity, Tim, that almost says the same thing that you've just said then. And it makes me think that there is a difference in how we live our life, at least in the West, but the difference is us and how we're not responsive to the world or responsible to our forms of thinking with the world. So I sort of feel an at-stateness behind that question, which is really important, but I kind of feel the answer is not in understanding the difference between art and technology. It comes back to us, whether we're, however you want to conceive of us, souls, subjects, anthropomorphic, indigenous, non-indigenous, messed up, crazy, there is a substance that lives and thinks. And what, as Bohm says, one of the things, at least in the West, we don't do enough is actually take on board what impact thinking has on what we think is real, which, Tim, just coming back to you, is another aspect of why your book is so amazing, because it's, you know, using that difficult word imagination and reverse engineering it and actually saying, no, it comes back to us and what we do with things, and that this is not a negative whip. This is, you know, a positive movement. I don't know if you want to add to that at all, or
well,
I want to come in.
That's very nice. I just want to mention one thing, and that is to question why it always is, why it so commonly is, that when we talk about the problem of the future, it's so often framed as a techno-scientific one, as though the future is a technological problem. I think that's very well, it's very short-term view of things, and I'm trying to shift it in such a way that we could say, no, actually, the future is about kinship. Going back to the discussion we had earlier, it's about kinship. It's not about technology, and we should start framing it in the right way, and really standing up to those people who keep telling us that we are marching towards a brave new world of artificial intelligence and virtual reality, which has no real place for most human beings on the planet who have nothing to do, as though this is inevitable and we better just get used to it. I find this rather nauseating when people get up and write popular books along these lines. And I think we should be standing up and confronting it.
Yes, I couldn't agree more with that. And it reminds me of a chapter David Bohm wrote with Mark Edwards in Changing Consciousness called Technological Ascent and Psychological Descent. And I'm so glad you brought up the issue of impact, Hester. And I think in our modern world, when we think of art, getting back to the original question, art's impact is, beauty, provocation, so many things. And technology today has become so problematic in terms of its impact on the planet and on people. And so I agree, we need to really be concerned with and critique that techno-utopian or techno-dystopian future that is being laid out as an inevitable for humanity and that planet right now. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Hester, and thank you, Tim. I'd like to take a little turn in our conversation here. And if I can get my head around the technology of this computer and get the screen up properly, then I'll move us on to, okay, another quote from Tim's book, and then, I'll pose a question following this quote. Tim says, I argue for a mode of attention that waits upon the world, joining with the process of its formation. To imagine, then, is not to dwell in appearances rather than reality, but to participate from within through perception and action in the very appearing of things. It is, in this sense, to move upstream, to inhabit the cusp upon which, at every moment, the world is on the verge of disclosure. So, Tim, this theme that's in that quote, it shows up time and again in your book. And one of the questions that I keep running into in working with what you've written is the doing of this. It's one thing to hold it as a concept. It's another thing to enter into what we might call that availability, to enter into that place where we're in some sense participating in the unfolding or the emergence of the world moment to moment. So I'm hoping for a bit here, maybe from some different angles, but certainly I would like to hear your thoughts, Tim, even from a personal perspective. How does this work out in daily life? How do we enter into the world in the way that you've talked about?
I think the answer is that probably for most of the time we can't, and that in order to just get on with our everyday lives from one moment to the next, we have to, it's a matter of practicality, since sort of have to take things as they are and deal with them as they go along in fairly expected and routine ways. But we don't have to be doing that all the time, and I think there are particular moments and times of astonishment when you find yourself, as I put it, moving upstream, suddenly finding yourself at the moment of opening your eyes to the world for the first time. And I get back to Hester here because I think because I think this is really what art is about. That surely this is what an artist does. If you read what the phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty writes about Cézanne, he's talking about Cézanne as a sort of the archetypal painter, the painter like Cézanne, is someone who paints as if he were opening his eyes on the world for the first time, as if somehow he was just at that very moment, so that the painting doesn't simply represent what is already there. It's the painting. It's not representing anything. It's actually bringing that world, the visible world, into existence. And I always go back to the famous creative credo of Paul Klee, another fine painter. Art does not represent the visible. Art makes visible. It brings something. It brings a new life into being, rather like a gardener planting flowers that is setting a pattern of growth going, and once it's planted, that plant will have a life in the world, and the same goes for the artwork. So that I think it's practically a quite difficult thing to do. In anthropology, we come across the same thing in many discussions about animism. Animism is also a kind of attitude, a kind of way of being in the world that starts from the premise that things are not already there, all laid out, but are there on the cusp, just coming into being. And people talk about, animism would be a great thing. If only we were all animists, we'd be so. And actually, it's really tough. It's really difficult, and it makes you really anxious. And you simply cannot be like that all the time. It just makes life too difficult. But you can try sometimes, and when you do, then the rewards are immense. I mean, that you do make discoveries about the world. You notice things that you hadn't noticed before, and they then become. We talk about that using sort of corny words like inspiration and so on. But this is real enough. I mean, we are sometimes inspired, and those inspirations then carry us through all sorts of more mundane activities. They feed us in that sort of way. So I think it's a matter of not living like that all the time. I don't think that's possible, except for the odd recluse or monk or something like that. But to treat it as an aspiration, as something that one can try to do sometimes. And there are people like I think composers as well as artists are showing us an example of how this can be done.
So one piece of this, and of course, what we're talking about now has a very strong overlap and engagement with what Bohm was referring to by participatory consciousness, which was a big part of his work later in his life, which involved how do we live the imagination of the implicate order and not just have it as a theory. So it seems to me that one piece of this, Tim, you often refer to Merleau-Ponty in your book, The Phenomenologists, and I think it's in reference to him that you bring out the term pre-conscious. So one of the questions is, for me, in experimenting with this, in trying to get into the inside of the world, has to do with testing whether what we normally think of as pre-conscious can be shifted somewhat. And maybe that's what happens with artists and creative people, I'm not sure. But speaking as someone who doesn't have that kind of creativity, it does seem to me that what is the upstream? That's the term that you use also, Tim. So I think that by working with this notion of moving upstream, that we can move somewhat into this larger domain in which we as subject and the world as object haven't yet totally formed.
Mhm.
And it's not easy to do, but I think it's important to suggest that it is doable, even though it's not easy. It's doable, that we can find ourselves, another word you use is milieu, the middle place, before those dichotomies have fully formed. And from within that milieu, many different worlds can emerge, rather than just the one that we keep waking up to every day. So for me, this is part of what imagining for real is working with this such that we can, as much as we can, as you point out, living like that 24 hours a day for most of us is probably not likely, but I think with intention, not so much a muscular effort, but with a kind of soft intention, we can find ourselves in that milieu, in that middle place in which worlds come into being, and we can participate with that.
I hope so. I mean, just to add one thing to that, one of the authors that I've found really helpful in thinking through all this is a philosopher, Erin Manning, and she has worked a lot with autistic people. She's also an artist in her own right, but studies of autism have been particularly interesting because what she suggests is that those little spaces which sometimes trip us up and sometimes astonish us, in which we suddenly find the world hasn't quite settled out as we thought it had. For autistic people, that's how the world is most of the time. And that's why it's so difficult for them to inhabit a so-called neurotypical world, because for them, what for us is just a momentary moment of doubt. You say, what's that? Oh, I know what it is. Is that a tree? Yes, that's a tree. But if we sort of things immediately settle into place as to the things they are, and once they settle into place, we know how to deal with them in a routine way. For autistic people who are hypersensitive compared with most of us, this moment of doubt is prolonged, sometimes indefinitely, and the result is often work that is we find extraordinarily creative, and Manning's point is that we can learn a huge amount from this kind of experience, and that maybe it'd be a good idea if we all tried to work at valuing these moments of flux and uncertainty, because if it wasn't for those, we'd all be stuck. The world would be all jammed up. Everything would be slotted into place, and there'd be no possibility of us moving anywhere. We can move, we can grow, we can develop, do things, because the plates are always shifting a bit. There's room for maneuver to do things. So, we should be celebrating loose ends rather than bureaucrats always go on about joined up thinking, and actually we've got far too much of that. And we should do a little less joining up and a bit more loose ends.
Thank you. And just a last point on that, I'm so happy that you bring up the question of autism. I think that when we find ourselves with autistic people, that if we were to pay much more attention to their being and their state and their quality, that we can not just learn a great deal in general, but we could learn a great deal about this very question of being in this uncertain state, and in a sense correspond with them and be in that to some extent with them. And I think many good things would accrue from taking that approach with autistic people. So thank you for bringing that out. Hester, Melissa, further things. I know we've all got a basket full of issues we would like to raise, and we won't get them all out, but let's keep going.
Hester, you want to go? Okay, we're being flat. Mine, I think, is really short. I really loved your chapter 2 on sight and sound. And I know you've done quite a bit of work on looking at how, the eye brings you into the world, and the sound brings the world into the human being. And this subtle process you just described earlier of being with the world, making with the world, imagining for real, requires a certain receptivity, requires a certain vulnerability or exposure. And yet it seems in this modern society, it's all about calluses and armor and not being receptive and kind of putting things forward, our technology, the rockets into space, this outward, some would say masculine kind of motion. And yet this subtle process of imagining for real that you're talking about requires a certain receptivity and vulnerability or porosity in order to have this correspondence. And yet it seems that quality has kind of atrophied in modern society. And we know that we've been referring to, not without overly romanticizing, but pockets of Indigenous people and artists have maintained a certain ventilated porosity that allows that emergence to happen. So I'm just curious, what you think about the kind of the state of this possibility of how to engender this in a way that is transformative for society.
I wish I had the answer to that. I mean, I think it's what we're all looking for, and the prospects are fairly terrifying, because we can talk. We spend a lot of time talking amongst ourselves with people, like-minded people, and then realize that out there is the rest of the world, and who seem to be, well, anyway, it's difficult to know how you can shift the mountain.
Yes.
But and sometimes a bit depressing. But my own feeling, I suppose, because I've been an educator all my life, as a university teacher, but I feel the answer has to lie in the way we understand education, and that needs a quite radical shift. And so by sort of focusing in on education specifically, it allows us to say, well, this is something we can tackle. Let's look about how are we educating future generations, and how might we do it differently? Because I think that's the place that I would start. And the way I would want to do it differently, above all, is by bringing old people and young people together in co-creating the future. I think one of the most tragic things that's happened in the history of modernity, and so going back, say, if you go back to that time at which educational functions were transferred from the family or the kin group to the state. And so the state took responsibility for education. That was sort of also at the same time as some other things were happening, growth of capitalism and nation state power and bureaucracies and so on. But what it did was to split apart the older generation and the younger generation. So the old people, they've had their time. It's time for them to fade away gracefully, retire, die. And the young people are supposed to be trained up for the future that is waiting for them. So that old and young have been separated on opposite sides. The young getting ready, the old past it. Neither then is given a chance to actually participate in creating the future. That's all being done by what I'm calling generation now, the people in the middle, the adults, grown-ups, who are busy making history.
Right.
And so the first thing I would want to do is to completely restructure education in such a way that it is understood as the way the way in which generations collaborate, not the way in which one generation passes on knowledge, information to the next, but the way in which generations work together in creating, co-creating a world, and to see education as that process. But how we get from where we are to that, it's I don't know. We'll just have to work at it. But maybe the first thing, one at least has to have an idea of what it is that one's trying to achieve, as to what the kind of educational principles are that we want to establish, and that's a start. But so I'm looking at that, but getting them actually realizing all this in practice, it's going to be a tall order, and I think it will take a long time.
That's right. Yes, thank you. And I would add the intergenerational aspect is so key, because I've been in education too about 30 years. And also interspecies. We may come up with a better word. I know you've been critical of the multi-species ethnography area. I agree. I've been a little critical of that too, but I like the idea that people are looking beyond collaboration just between humans, elders, youngers, experts, artists, etc., but then looking at collaborating with the trees, the forest, you know, the animals, etc., as most traditional cultures have always done.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. It's the hype around multi-species that's getting me down.
Yes,
it's really tiresome.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stretch my luck here and try to put up one more PowerPoint. A technology that I'm not particularly fond of, but it does have its uses. This is Tim, again from your book. And in this case, right. In this case, it's a quote that you've used. And from the quote, you open up, to my mind, one of the most beautiful sequences in the book. And this is from Lars Sporebroek, who is an architect and an architectural theorist. And what he says comes from an experience he had being out in a field. And he comes across a group of stones. And he says this: clearly, the stones are lying there in a certain correspondence, if not accordance, because the wind and the water have moved them, rolled them over the ground, and made them find an impression, create a little group, a little nest, where a plant could start growing and be protected. But where does my liking fit in? Is it merely in me, subjectively enjoying the sight? Or is it an extended correspondence? I am with the stones and plant immediately, fitting in with them. So, Tim, if you're willing, I would love for you to comment a bit on that passage and why you included it. And perhaps that would take us to one of your themes of assemblage rather than gathering, but we don't need to go that far. It's just the spirit of that passage and the meaning that you've extracted from it. If you would share with us.
I like Lars Boybrook's work very much, and it's some of the most inspiring stuff that I've read in a while. And in the context, when I introduced that particular quotation, I'm trying to explain this concept of correspondence that I develop in the book. And correspondence there has a very particular meaning of going along together and answering to one another as you go. That's what I mean by it. Co-responding. So each is co-responding. Each participant is co-responding to the other as they go along. So I'm trying to introduce that concept, and Lars in that quote actually uses the word correspondence, so it fits very well with what I'm trying to say. And there are three things that I kind of extract from that particular quotation. One is about the difference between assemblage and gathering that Lee, you just mentioned. I have to explain it just very briefly, or it gets a bit technical. Assemblage has become a kind of a must-have accessory for every aspiring theorist these days. I mean, you just have to use it, and everything is an assemblage. It's become one of those words that is so overused that it can mean anything. And in the particular chapter of the book, the particular essay that this quote is in, I'm trying to cut this notion of assemblage down to size, really, and to make a distinction between what I'm calling the assemblage and the gathering. And by saying that assemblage is when you butt a whole lot of things up together. You make a heap of I've got some pens here. I just bang them on my table. There's an assemblage. You've got a jumble of things sort of bundled up together. The gathering is where things join in with one another and wrap around one another. So it's a difference, if you like, between a mosaic and a weave. With the mosaicist takes all these little tiny bits and pieces of stone and forms them into some kind of a pattern. The weaver has a lot of threads and binds them, weaves them around one another to form a textile. And what I'm trying to show is actually in anything we make, we just about always find these two principles working together. And I want to show how they work together. And just to give you one example, suppose you are putting together a model aeroplane from a kit of parts. You buy this kit, like the Airfix kit, you buy it from a shop, and you get all these little bits of plastic, which are supposed to fit together according to what it says in the instructions. You put them all together, and you get the completed model aeroplane. And then the kit says, but you need one thing more. You need a tube of glue. And you say, well, where does that fit? Now, is the glue just another part, or what? And then it turns out that actually the glue is what holds the whole thing together. It adds the coherence to it, and it does so because glue consists of these long protein molecules that penetrate the plastic surfaces and form a kind of weave that, when as the glue dries, tightens it. So it literally binds all these parts together, and that's how glue works. So you see how in the making your kit, you have these two principles. You have the assemblage, that's all these bits fitted together, but you also have the gathering, which is what the glue does in holding all that together. So in this particular quote, I want to show that there's more when Lars is talking about this little group of stones, the plant that's growing in the middle of it, him coming along and saying, oh, that's nice. The first thing is that this is not just an assemblage. It's not just a pile of stones in a plant, because you have to think, well, how did the stones get there? How did the seed get there? And as you start asking those questions, you get into the actions of wind and weather, flood, rainfall that might have moved those stones or eroded them from the bedrock in the first place. So you get into a whole history of stories that have brought these stones and that seed to that particular place. So it's more than just an assemblage of bits and pieces. It's a gathering. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second, I wanted to say how in this story, Lars presents himself as a participant in the gathering. He's a participant observer. He's looking at what he sees, but he's looking from the inside. He's joining in the story. He's becoming, along with the stories of the stones and the plant and so on. So he's joining in the gathering. And the third thing is that he says that he's asking himself, where does he likes this, but where does my liking fit in? And he's developing this as part of a wider argument about what he calls sympathy, because it's in a book called The Sympathy of Things. And by sympathy, he's not meaning in some sort of psychological disposition or so they, I feel for these stones. It's nothing to do with that. It's simply to do with the way in which things find themselves coming together and responding to one another. And they can do that because things have a certain elasticity that when the stones rub against one another, they're not completely external one another. They scratch one another. They roll. They bump. Things go on in between them, and it's what's going on in between the stones and the plant and
You go good?
that,
How long you been for us?
that really matters.
So just a follow-up on that, and thank you for bringing this out in more detail. A couple of things out of that. The question of his liking of his personal, so-called personal feeling about this, as you're suggesting, it's really something more than that it has to do with how all of this has come together and that he's now participating in that. And it's that whole nexus that is what he likes. And also, as you describe this further in your book, you talk about it has to do with the feeling he has for this gathering. And I couldn't help but wonder when I was reading about Lars's feeling for this gathering of stones and plant and water and wind, were those stones also feeling him?
Yes, they were, because this isn't anything to do with a subjective state of mind.
Yes.
And it's simply about participating in the gathering.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the point. So and it's a central theme of his of his book, that sympathy is what things feel when they join up with one another. But you could perfectly well say, if you're building a log cabin and you're joining the corners of the beams using a mortise and tenon joint, so that one beam on one corner slots into the other, and you cut this joint neatly so that they really fit. That would be an example of the same thing. It is actually you could talk about the interiority of that join, about the way those beams actually feel one another. You could talk about relations of sympathy in Lars's sense there.
Wonderful, thank you. So Melissa and Hester, we're coming up toward the top of the hour. If there are some last points or queries that you would like to make, let's keep moving.
It's not to open up too much, because I know we're coming towards the end, but I think also another weave that goes through the book, and it sort of links to a lot of what we've said, and particularly to this issue of astonishment and education. And when we talk about the tall order of transformation, it is a tall order. And then part of me goes, it's not a tall order at all, because each one of us has an innate capacity for astonishment, which I'm sure you all agree with. I'm not trying to say anything new, but and I like the tension, because there's another sort of movement, and actually coming up with big models isn't really going to help. Not that I know the answer, but it makes me think of when you talk about reversing the relationship between doing or making and undergoing. I think that's relevant here. And again, it's another very resonant, important part of what your book does, you know. And I don't know if there's any last comments you want to make about that. And I suppose what I'm getting at here is, it is about participation, but each one of us is a substance. Now, I'm not talking about ego and subjectivity, but we are a substance in existence. And that is somehow always potentially open to that astonishment. But somehow the educational processes we have and the very language we use, Bohm would say, strangely, because all we want is to have the intense pleasure of being and being with, but our education, our language systems, ironically, cut us off from that without us even realizing. So this notion of undergoing, and it comes back from, it is about interrelating, but it also comes back to specific substance in existence. So I don't know if there's any, that seems relevant to also bring into the mix, but again.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought in doing and undergoing, because we haven't mentioned it before, and it is terribly important. It gets back to this. I did mention it briefly in relation to this middle voice of the verb, that that we are stuck with this dichotomy between the active and the passive sense. And the active is I do something, passive. No, the active is to do. The passive is to undergo. And what I've been trying to do, and here I'm following John Dewey, actually, who wrote about this, is to say doing, undergoing. What we do is what we undergo. That undergoing is not passive; it's in itself active, but only because we are inside what we do. And I think that really is terribly important. And I mean, where I come from, engaging with all these people in social theory and whatnot, it does imply a critique of the understandings of agency that are very predominant. I really think that there's been an obsession in theoretical literature with agency, which I think has been at the expense of understanding life. I have the feeling the more people talk about agency, the less they talk about life, and vice versa. And I think we should go back to life instead of all this agency speak.
Sorry, that's so important. I mean, I think we all agree a lot of what's been said today is important, but that is astonishing and so important. So thank you so much for saying that. It's in the book, but you said it, and I have some resonance.
And it's recorded.
Thank you, Hester and Tim. Melissa,
well, I know we're really short on time. One of my last comments or questions is about time, and we don't have time. So I think I would love to just open it up, Lee, for your close. Or I'm sad to see there's so many great hands up for questions. I think it would be great if we could take a couple.
Yes, so let's do that. James, let's take two questions.
Could we let someone speak? Right, there are some, I can't see the chat. I'm sure there's brilliant questions.
Yes.
I can see some yellow hands, and
many hands.
It'd be great to hear the voice of other people. Not that I'm in any way not enjoying the voices of...
Quite right. So let's hear from people that have their hands up, James.
Yes, of course, we can take a couple of questions. Firstly, we'll go to Pam, who's had her hand up for a while now.
Pam?
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone. Amazing as usual. But just to throw this couple of words into the mix, because it struck me that there is a real connection between a lot of the things that you've all been saying, but I haven't heard the words reciprocal maintenance used in relation to any of them. But it occurs to me that perhaps things like you've mentioned kinship, and you've mentioned...
Yeah, they were kind of crazy price.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, excuse me. Before we continue, someone in the audience has continually left their microphone open with conversations going on in the background. And if you could all please monitor and realize that when you speak, it's interrupting what we're trying to converse with here. That would be greatly appreciated. So Pam, I'm sorry to interrupt you there. If you want to come back.
Okay, I hope this is not too naive, but just to push it a little bit further, you talk about linear movement and correspondence with Earth, and bringing forth the world through imagination. Now, I'm an artist, I'm a painter, and I paint things that are not visible, so I'm not representational. So all of my work has been to try to perhaps unify disparate things that do not seem to have any connection with one another, but which in fact are intrinsically connected. So I won't go into any of that now, that's not the point. But what I am very interested in at the moment is this notion of reciprocal maintenance, because we're living in a terrible time where things are being destroyed. Civilization is not working very well right now. And it seems to me that a little bit of sympathy, as you've mentioned also, could be brought into some kind of a dialogue through this reciprocal idea of us and everything else, since we are the world anyway. So we have to reciprocate in this way. And I loved, Tim, the quote of the stones from Lars. And it occurred to me that the stones and the plant were in total reciprocation with the wind and the sea. And that's how they ended up in that beautiful place. So anyway, that's all I want to say. And thank you so much. I'm just so excited by this whole thing, I can't tell you. It's just brilliant.
Well, thanks. I think what you're calling reciprocal maintenance, which is a nice idea. I think it's all virtually the same as what I'm meaning by correspondence.
Yes, exactly.
So
I just wanted to put the words in because I've just made a painting, which is the beginning of a new series.
Okay. I mean, I'm pretty sure we're on exactly the same page and using different words. And I have use the word maintenance. I've still been puzzling over the word sustainability. I mean, maintaining something is also about sustaining it.
Quite.
And I've been thinking that rather than chuck out the idea of sustainability because it's so misused, it's something we need to retain.
Work at.
But to give it, but with the proper meaning, as simply a sort of mutual carrying on of things.
Yeah.
Which I think is again
mutual reciprocation, if you like, is another way to put it.
Which is, yeah, I'm perfectly happy to buy your your words for it. I shall continue to use correspondence, but
I'm fond of our words. I like responsibility.
Yeah,
that's another one.
But you can't have responsibility without responsiveness.
No.
and that's what we're really getting at there.
And in fact, Tim, earlier you did use the term reciprocal obligation, which is certainly related to both.
I didn't hear that.
Yes.
I think I slipped it in,
Yes.
So we're on the same page.
Yeah. So James.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Pam.
James, one more brief question, and then I think we need to come to a close.
Yes, of course. We'll go to Tala next.
Yes, sorry, I'm not very, I have technical issues over here. Back to the example or discussion about the stone and the human being able to enjoy. I think, Lee, you mentioned, or you were wondering if the stones could feel that as well. The answer that Timothy, you responded with was yes, you felt they could. In our limited language is limited, of course, but my question is, could we expand on that? What would, if you could put words together to describe what the stones would feel and how they would experience that connection with the human? Sorry to make it so simple, but I'm just trying to make the question easy. Can you expand on that? What would that be?
It actually, it soon becomes very complicated indeed. But just as a simple example to which I've used to explain what I mean. Imagine that you have a hard ball, something like a cricket ball, which if you were to throw it against something, it would knock it over, and a soft ball, like one made out of a sponge, and you threw that. And what's the difference? The difference, if you throw the soft ball at a target, then the ball itself will deform a little bit, taking into itself something of the attributes of the target at which it is thrown, whereas the target itself will take into itself something of the ball. Right? That's the difference between a hard one and if it's hard, if it just knocks and bang, crack, you break the window or whatever. But if it's soft, then both the ball and its target will deform in such a way that they take into themselves something of the quality of the other. So that's what I mean by things, and what Lars means, I think, by things feeling one another. It's not to do with any kind of psychological state or what I'm in the colloquial say, what I'm feeling great or I'm feeling rotten. It's not to do with that. It's much more simply feeling as a kind of contact between bodies that is mutually influential. But then it soon gets much more complicated, because then you start thinking, well, actually, a human being does actually feel differently from a tree, which feels differently from a stone. Just to give you one quick example, because I know time is short, but I've been working with the Italian artist, one of the co-founders of Arte Povera, Giuseppe Pennone, who's done a lot of work with trees. And so he has a picture of himself grasping the rather slender trunk of a tree. And next thing he does, he casts his hand in bronze, and he puts the bronze hand on the tree. And after a while, the tree is growing. After many years, the tree kind of grows around this bronze hand. So you cannot actually pull the bronze hand out anymore. But the bronze hand is still there. And immediately you ask these questions, okay, does the tree notice the difference between the human hand and the bronze hand? Or is it just the same? And what about the bronze hand? And it starts becoming, the tree is growing around the bronze hand, but the bronze hand is not growing around the tree. So you then begin to realize that actually a hand cast of bronze, a growing piece of wood in a tree, a human hand, they're not the same thing. You can't simply treat them as simply interchangeable. And that's actually when it really begins to get interesting as to what is actually going on in this thing we're just calling feeling. It's a blanket term for a lot of really interesting and complicated things going on.
And
Thank you.
Wouldn't it be amazing if we had David Bohm with us right now to talk about that one? We didn't, of course, but wow, that would be incredible. Great question.
And one phrase that Cree ethicist Willie Ermine talks about is the ethical space of engagement. And that is that feeling you're talking about, Tim, of two beings coming together in reciprocal relationship. Yeah, beautiful.
Well, I think we've come to a point where we have a kind of embarrassment of riches with these loose ends that are dangling, and that we can take away from our conversation today, not necessarily something fixed and finished, but these open-ended questions. So I would like so much, Melissa, thank you for joining us. Thank you for making this go where it went. Hester, thank you for joining us and bringing so much of who you are to this. And Tim, thank you for taking time out of a very busy schedule and sharing a flavor of your book and the quality of your thought and who you are, what it is that comes out of your inner being that the books show us in a certain way. Much for us all to work with. So thank you all, and thank you all in the audience for coming and staying with us throughout the session. And thank you, James and Eleanor at the Pari Center. We've had a great discussion today. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, James.
Oh, thank you very much, Lee. Well, thank you everyone for this great session. Thank you, Lee, for participating in this weekend in this session, of course, for organizing this event. Thank you, Hester and Melissa, for returning to be part of this panel with us here at the Pari Center. And of course, thank you so much, Tim, for accepting our invitation and joining us for this fantastic session where you talked about your book. And of course, thank you to all the audience. I apologize for those who had questions, but we weren't able to get to you. But of course, feel free to share your thoughts and questions on Sutra, and I'm sure they'll spark a good conversation on our forum. Just a couple of things. I mentioned Sutra just now. If you haven't received an invite to join the forum, please let us know, and we can, of course, send you a link to join. I also wanted to invite you to next week's sessions, where we will talk about creativity, where we will have a two-part weekend, where the title will be Processes of Creation, where we will have guests Siwan Bro, Aja Bulla Richards, Sky Horner, and again, Hester Reeve, where of course we'll be talking about creativity. I also wanted to invite you to an event that will happen on Wednesday, the 13th of July, so the Wednesday coming, which is the new installment of The Future Scientist, where Alex Gomez-Marin will be in conversation with Peter Husted Hughes, who's a philosopher of mind and metaphysician who specializes in fields pertaining to altered and panpsychological state of consciousness. Together, they will discuss the intersectional role of altered state of minds, psychedelics in science and religion, and its role for the possible future scientist. In the meantime, you can always email us at eleanor@paricenter.com or our website on the contact us section or on social media. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you all again to the panelists, and we'll see you again soon here at the Pari Center.
Thank you.